The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat quietly at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by the sounds of wind, leaves, and distant animal calls. It wasn't a big or famous place, just a small group of people trying to help injured and abandoned animals return to the wild. Among them was a new volunteer named Mira. She didn't come with impressive qualifications or long experience. She came with something different, a kind of quiet patience that most people overlook. From her first day, Mira stood out for her calm way of moving. While others rushed to finish tasks, she took her time. She listened more than she spoke. When the senior caretakers assigned her to feed injured birds, she handled each one as if it were made of glass. Her care was gentle, almost too gentle in the eyes of others. They whispered that she wouldn't last long. The job wasn't easy. It meant cleaning cages, dealing with frightened animals, and facing the harsh reality that not all could be saved. A week later, the center received a call about 2 predator cubs found near a hunting zone. Their mother had likely been killed. When they arrived, the cubs were terrified, small, wild creatures with sharp teeth and sharper fear. They growled and scratched at anyone who tried to get near. The senior staff debated what to do. "They're too dangerous for new volunteers," one of them warned. But the center was short-staffed and someone needed to care for them. That's when Mira quietly stepped forward. "I can try," she said simply. The others looked doubtful. To them, Mira seemed too soft, too gentle to handle wild predators. But she didn't flinch when they warned her about bites or scratches. She had seen fear before, not just in animals but in people too. And she knew that fear needed understanding, not force. Her first day with the cubs was full of tension. They were kept in a secure cage, pacing and growling. Mira didn't reach in or shout commands. Instead, she sat down a few feet away and stayed silent. She just watched them, letting them get used to her presence. Hours passed and she didn't move. The cubs eventually stopped pacing and started watching her back. For the first time, the space between human and wild grew a little quieter. When her shift ended, the other volunteers expected her to be shaken. Instead, she smiled softly. "They're not angry," she said. "They're scared." No one understood how she could be so calm. But Mira wasn't trying to prove anything. She didn't want to tame the wild. She just wanted to give it peace. That night, as the lights dimmed in the center, the cubs curled up together, still watchful, but quieter than before. It was a small change, barely noticeable. Yet for Mira, it was the beginning of something she couldn't quite name. Something that would one day change how everyone saw her. The cubs were unlike any other animals at the center. They weren't just frightened, they were broken. Every sound made them flinch, every shadow made them snarl. When anyone came close, they lunged and bit at the metal bars, their eyes wide with panic. They refused to eat, refused to rest, and seemed ready to fight the entire world. The staff kept their distance, shaking their heads in frustration. "Leave them alone," one caretaker said. "They'll calm down on their own." But Mira didn't believe in leaving fear alone. Fear didn't fade with time. It faded with trust. Every morning, after finishing her chores, Mira would bring a stool and sit beside their cage. She never forced food through the bars, never reached in to pet them. She simply sat. Sometimes she hummed quietly. Other times she read from an old notebook she always carried. It wasn't a manual or a report. It was filled with her own thoughts, little notes about patience, kindness, and the quiet way nature heals itself. Her voice was steady and warm, not loud enough to startle, but clear enough to be heard. At first, the cubs ignored her completely. They stayed pressed against the far corner, growling and watching her with tense eyes. But Mira didn't move. She didn't react to the growls or show any fear. She just turned a page and continued reading. The sound of her voice began to mix with the sounds of the center, the rustle of leaves, the calls of birds, the footsteps of staff in the distance. Slowly, her presence became part of their world, something constant and calm in a place full of confusion. Days passed, and while the other volunteers saw no change, Mira noticed small signs, a flicker of curiosity, a twitch of an ear, the moment one cub stopped growling for just a second longer than before. These tiny moments gave her hope. She started leaving food near the bars, not pushing it inside, but close enough that they could smell it if they wanted to. Then she'd return to her stool, open her notebook, and start reading again. Some evenings, when everyone else had gone home, she'd stay behind. The room would grow quiet except for the soft sound of her voice. Under the dim yellow light, the cubs would finally lower their heads, not asleep, but calmer than before. They didn't yet trust her, but they no longer saw her as a threat. Something in the way she stayed, not forcing, not demanding, was changing the air between them. By the end of the week, Mira still hadn't touched them, and they still hadn't accepted food from her hand. But the cage no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a waiting place, a space where something fragile was beginning to grow. Patience, she thought, wasn't about waiting for change. It was about becoming part of it. The morning was quiet except for the soft clinking of metal bowls. Mira placed 2 dishes near the edge of the cub's cage, as she had done every day. The cubs watched her closely, muscles tense, eyes flicking from her hands to the food and back again. They hadn't eaten properly in days, refusing anything when a human was near. Most of the staff thought it was pointless, that the cubs would starve before they trusted anyone. But Mira didn't believe that. Hunger could be eased, but fear needed time. So she didn't coax them or speak too much. She simply sat down on her usual stool, opened her old notebook, and began reading softly, her voice steady and gentle. The cubs sniffed the air, their small bodies trembling with hesitation. One of them, the smallest, took a cautious step forward, claws scraping against the floor. The other cub growled low, warning him to stop, but hunger was stronger than fear that morning. Mira didn't move. She didn't even lift her head. She just kept reading, pretending she didn't notice. The brave cub sniffed the bowl once, then backed away, then came closer again. Finally, with a small shaky movement, it took a bite. The sound of soft chewing filled the air, and for Mira, it was like hearing music. She didn't smile or clap. She knew any sudden reaction might ruin everything. Instead, she turned another page and continued her quiet rhythm, as if this small miracle was just part of the day. The other cub watched, still suspicious. But when nothing bad happened, it too crept closer. Both ate slowly, pausing between bites to glance at her. Mira could feel their uncertainty, but also something new, curiosity. They were beginning to wonder if maybe this human wasn't a threat. For the first time, the air between them wasn't filled with growls, but with calm silence. When the bowls were empty, the cubs didn't retreat to the far corner. They stayed where they were, licking their paws, occasionally glancing at the woman who had been so still, so patient. Mira finally closed her notebook, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't reach out or speak, just offered a quiet nod as if thanking them for the moment. Then she left the room, letting them rest in peace. That night, when the other staff returned to check on the cubs, they found the bowls licked clean. It was the first time in weeks. One of them asked, "What did you do?" Mira only smiled faintly and said, "Nothing. I just waited." It wasn't a grand victory, but it was the first step, a bridge built from stillness, not control. From that day on, when she entered the room, the cubs didn't hide or snarl. They simply watched her with quiet eyes, remembering the one human who didn't force them to trust. She let them choose it on their own. Each morning, Mira carried her notebook and pen to the cubs' cage, placing them carefully on the floor beside her stool. She would sit down and begin her work, jotting notes, sketching observations, or writing reminders for the center, all while keeping her movements calm and deliberate. At first, the cubs watched warily from the corners of their cage, tails flicking and ears pricked for any sudden motion. But Mira didn't reach for them or call to them. She simply existed in their space, a steady presence that made no sudden demands. Hours passed like this, the soft scratch of her pen the only sound breaking the quiet. Day by day, the cubs grew more comfortable. The smallest one would creep closer, resting its chin on the edge of her notebook as if it were a pillow. The middle cub, once quick to growl at any motion, would now sit on its haunches, eyes following her carefully, learning the rhythm of her stillness. Even the largest cub, who had spent days pacing and snarling, began lying down a few feet away, muscles relaxing, tail wagging slightly in quiet curiosity. Mira didn't encourage these moments. She simply let them unfold. She knew that trust could not be demanded. It could only be invited through calm consistency. Other staff noticed the changes and whispered among themselves. "Look at her," one said. "She hasn't touched them in days, but they're calm." Another laughed softly. "She's like a beast tamer." Mira heard their joking nickname, but didn't mind. She didn't see herself as taming anything. She was learning from them as much as they were learning from her. Lessons in patience, observation, and quiet respect for the wild. Sometimes the cubs would nap beside her notebook, curling up in soft piles near her legs, unafraid and warm in her presence. Mira kept her posture relaxed, not leaning toward them or making sudden movements. Her pen continued its soft scratching, her voice silent except for the occasional whispered note about the day's observations. The air between them was no longer tense. It was filled with a sense of peace, a fragile bridge of understanding that only grew stronger with each calm hour. Visitors to the center often paused to watch, amazed that the cubs had gone from snarling, frightened animals to creatures resting quietly beside a human. Mira didn't speak much to them about it. She didn't need to. The work itself, the presence of gentle consistency, was the message. She knew that forcing affection or dominance would only break the trust she had earned. By the end of the week, the cubs had changed in ways that were almost imperceptible to an outsider, but monumental to Mira. Their eyes followed her softly, not with suspicion, but recognition. They had learned that a human could be still, quiet, and harmless. And Mira, in turn, had learned that patience could speak louder than any command, and stillness could invite understanding in a way that noise and force never could. When the staff teased her later, calling her the beast tamer with a laugh, Mira only smiled gently. She knew the truth. She hadn't tamed the cubs at all. She had simply allowed the wild to rest, and in that rest, a fragile trust had been born. The night arrived with a heavy sky, the clouds dark and swollen, carrying the promise of a storm. Rain began to lash against the windows of the small wildlife rehabilitation center, and thunder growled in the distance, growing louder with every passing minute. Inside the cubs' cage, the three predator cubs, once only curious or mildly cautious, were now frantic. They bounced against the bars, their small bodies trembling, ears pinned back, and growls escaping their throats. The sound of wind whistling through cracks in the building only added to their terror. Staff members who peeked in from the doorway shook their heads and muttered warnings. "Stay back," they said. "It's too dangerous." "They're panicked." But Mira didn't hesitate. She walked into the cage area calmly, umbrella closed and coat dripping from the rain outside. She knelt on the floor at a safe distance from the bars and began to hum softly, a low, steady sound that cut through the roar of the storm. Her hands rested gently on her knees, movements slow and deliberate, as if she were signaling that there was no threat. At first, the cubs didn't respond. They growled and paced, muscles tight, ready to strike or flee. Mira didn't push, didn't call, didn't reach for them. She simply continued humming, letting her presence be a calm island in the chaos. Minutes passed like hours. The sound of her voice seemed to thread through the cubs' fear, touching the raw edges of their panic. One by one, their frantic movements slowed. The smallest cub sat on its haunches, ears twitching, eyes fixed on Mira. The middle cub inched closer to the bars, its breathing heavy but less frantic. Even the largest, most aggressive cub lowered its head, trembling but no longer crashing against the cage. Mira hummed steadily, never forcing interaction, simply allowing them to see that the storm outside could rage, but they were safe in her presence. Slowly, trust overcame instinct-driven fear. One cub approached the edge of the cage and pressed its body near Mira's feet. The others followed, curling around the bars, close but respectful of the space she had given them. By the time the storm reached its loudest, with lightning streaking across the sky and thunder shaking the walls, the cubs were no longer wild in panic. They had discovered the strange comfort of her presence. Eventually, they lay down, tails tucked, eyes closing as Mira continued humming softly. For the first time, they slept without fear, their bodies relaxing fully into the safety of the room. Mira stayed on the floor beside them until the storm passed, humming quietly, a quiet anchor for the frightened creatures. Staff members who watched from outside were amazed. "How did she do that?" one whispered. "She didn't touch them, she just stayed calm." Mira only smiled gently to herself. She knew that this night had been a turning point. It wasn't magic or force. It was patience, presence, and quiet care. The storm had tested them, and for the first time, the cubs had learned that not all humans brought fear. Some humans, like Mira, could be a shelter in the wildest storm. The morning was crisp, and sunlight streamed through the windows of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, catching the edges of dust motes in the air. Mira was kneeling beside the cubs' enclosure, carefully observing their movements as they played quietly with each other, when a visiting government official arrived. His expression was stern, lips pressed into a thin line, and he didn't waste time on greetings. He walked straight to Mira, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the cubs resting near her. "This is exactly what I feared," he said sharply. "You're humanizing them. They are wild animals, not pets. This hands-off, emotional approach, it's dangerous. It will ruin their instincts for survival." Mira remained calm, brushing a few crumbs from her notebook and taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm not trying to make them pets," she said quietly, her voice steady but gentle. "I'm helping them heal. These cubs came to us traumatized. Fear rules their lives right now. Forcing them, isolating them, or trying to dominate them will only reinforce panic. True healing comes when they learn to trust, when they understand that not every human is a threat." The official frowned, clearly unimpressed. He gestured toward the cubs whose ears flicked nervously at the raised voices. "Trust? They don't need trust. They need to be released as soon as possible. You're interfering with their natural instincts." Mira shook her head slightly, glancing down at the cubs who now nudged each other gently, showing a rare moment of calmness. Releasing them too soon, without preparing them mentally and emotionally, could be fatal, she said softly, almost pleading but firm. Healing isn't about control or bending them to human ways. It's about giving them the tools to survive while respecting their nature. They are still wild at heart. I only help them see that not every human is danger. The room fell silent for a moment as the staff and other observers took in her words. The official's lips tightened, but he was clearly surprised by the quiet confidence in Mira's tone. She didn't shout, she didn't demand compliance, yet her conviction filled the room in a way that made everyone pause. He muttered something about orders and protocols, but Mira's gaze stayed on the cubs, calm and unwavering, even after the official left. Ordering that the cubs be prepared for release within a week, Mira continued her method. She returned to the enclosure each day, notebook in hand, sitting on the floor with the cubs nearby, letting them eat, nap, and explore at their own pace. Staff who had doubted her began to watch more closely, seeing that the cubs were calmer, more confident, and more capable of handling new situations than anyone had expected. Mira's quiet patience was proving that rebuilding trust was stronger than enforcing control. She understood the skepticism of others, but she also knew that fear-based methods never created true resilience. Trust, presence, and gentle guidance were the lessons these cubs needed, not domination. Each day she spent with them reinforced that sometimes the world didn't need more rules. It needed more patience. Her method might seem unorthodox, but the results spoke for themselves, quietly transforming even the fiercest instincts into tempered, watchful strength. The morning air was crisp and full of the scent of pine and earth as Mira arrived at the fenced reserve, the cubs restless in their temporary enclosures. Today was the day they would take their first real steps outside, a chance to test their instincts in a safe but open environment. Mira walked slowly to the gate, keeping her movements calm and deliberate, letting the cubs see that nothing would be forced upon them. The staff had set up the reserve with logs, small streams, and patches of grass, enough to mimic the wild they would soon return to, yet contained enough to ensure their safety. Mira knelt beside the gate, her notebook in one hand, her other hand resting gently on the wooden frame, and waited. The cubs' eyes flicked nervously at the new surroundings. Their ears twitched, noses quivering as they picked up unfamiliar scents, and claws scratched softly at the dirt. One by one, they stepped toward the gate, cautious and tentative, their bodies low and movements deliberate. Mira didn't call them or coax them with treats. She only watched, her calm presence a silent encouragement. The first cub paused halfway, glanced at her, and Mira met its gaze with a soft smile. It was not a call for comfort. It was a shared understanding. She had guided them here, and now the next step was theirs. Slowly, the cub pushed the gate open with its snout and padded onto the open ground. The other two followed, tails low at first but beginning to sway as curiosity took over fear. They sniffed at the grass, pawed at fallen branches, and even tumbled playfully in the soft dirt. Each small exploration was a victory, a proof of the trust Mira had nurtured over weeks of careful patience. The wild was no longer a place of terror for them. It was a space to test themselves. Mira stayed kneeling near the gate, watching every movement. She noted how one cub hesitated near a stream, then touched the water with a cautious paw, mimicking the instinctive behavior she had only read about before. Another sniffed at the shadows of nearby trees, ears flicking at birdsong, while the third rolled on its back in the sun, relaxed in a way that would have been impossible weeks ago. She realized then that gentleness had not weakened them. It had given them the confidence to explore and understand the world around them. When she finally stood and took a step back, the cubs glanced over their shoulders. It was not a look of dependence, but a quiet acknowledgement. They knew she had been their guide, but they were ready to be wild again. Mira smiled, her heart full. She understood that this moment marked the culmination of patience, trust, and gentle guidance. The wild had accepted them again, and they had carried her lessons with them. No words were needed. The glance, the pause, the soft rustle of leaves beneath their paws was enough. She remained there for a while longer, letting them explore, knowing that the bond she had formed was not about control, but about giving them the freedom to be themselves, strong, aware, and unafraid. The first step outside was not just theirs. It was a testament to the quiet power of understanding between human and wild. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Mira arrived at the edge of the forest, carrying the cubs' cages carefully. Today was the day they would leave the safety of the reserve entirely, venturing into the vast, untamed wilderness they were born to inhabit. Mira's heart was heavy, but she knew this was the right moment. She knelt beside the open cage, setting down the last water bowl and letting the cubs peer out. Their eyes darted around, ears flicking at every distant sound, birds calling, leaves rustling, and the wind carrying scents unfamiliar yet exciting. They hesitated at the threshold of freedom, their small bodies tense but alert. Mira did not rush them. She simply sat beside them, her hands resting lightly on the cage door, her voice soft and steady, whispering words of encouragement without pressing them. The first cub moved slowly, pawing at the forest floor, testing the unfamiliar ground. Mira watched closely, her presence calm and reassuring, letting them take the lead. The second cub followed, hesitating only for a moment before stepping onto the soft earth, while the third lingered, glancing back at her as if to ensure she was still there. Mira smiled gently, understanding that this moment was about trust, not obedience. She extended a hand toward the nearest cub, not to restrain it, but to let it feel the security she had offered for so long. In a quiet, almost tender gesture, the first cub touched her hand with its small nose, a brief connection that spoke volumes, a silent thank you, a goodbye that wasn't truly an ending. Then, as if on cue, the cub bolted into the forest, ears flattened slightly, tail high, running freely through the trees. The other two followed soon after, moving with growing confidence, sniffing at every bush and hopping over fallen branches, their instincts returning in harmony with the lessons Mira had quietly taught them. She remained on her knees, watching their first moments of independence, realizing that she had never truly tamed them. No one could. Her role had been far more delicate and profound. She had reminded them that their world could be trusted, that not every encounter needed to be a threat, and that even in the wild, peace and caution could coexist. Mira stayed there for a long while, observing as the cubs disappeared deeper into the forest, weaving through shadows and sunlight. She felt a swell of pride and a quiet ache in her chest, knowing that this release was the culmination of weeks of patience, gentle guidance, and unwavering presence. Each movement they made reflected the subtle lessons of trust she had imparted, lessons not through force but through consistency, calm, and empathy. It was a moment of pure understanding, human and wild acknowledging each other without words. Finally, she rose, brushing the dirt from her hands, and whispered a soft goodbye, knowing that the bond they shared would endure even at a distance. The cubs were no longer dependent on her. They were free, confident, and ready to embrace the wild world that was always theirs, carrying with them the trust she had helped them rediscover. The night air was crisp and still as Mira set up her small campsite deep within the forest. Months had passed since she had released the cubs she had cared for so diligently, and her heart ached with both longing and hope, wondering how they had adapted to the wild. She was there on a survey, recording plant growth and wildlife activity, but part of her was listening for anything familiar, a sound or movement that would remind her of the cubs she had nurtured. As darkness settled and the campfire flickered, shadows danced across the trees, and the usual night sounds, hooting owls, rustling leaves, distant calls, filled the air. Mira sat quietly, her notebook open but untouched, lost in thought. Suddenly, a subtle, deliberate rustle caught her attention, different from the usual movements of the forest. She froze, her breath catching, and waited silently. From the shadows, a sleek shape emerged, moving with cautious confidence. It was one of the cubs, now fully grown, its fur thick and shining under the moonlight. Mira's heart raced, but she stayed still, careful not to startle the predator. The cub approached the edge of her campfire light, eyes reflecting curiosity and recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had shared months ago. Without hesitation, it carried something in its mouth, a small bird freshly caught. Gently, the cub set the offering on the ground a few feet from her blanket and stepped back, watching her intently as if waiting for a reaction. Mira felt a rush of emotion, awe, gratitude, and a quiet pride. This was not a pet seeking approval or food. This was a wild creature expressing trust and respect in the only way it knew how. She leaned forward slowly, careful to remain calm, and whispered soft words of thanks. Though she knew the cub could not understand her language. Its stance relaxed slightly, ears flicking, tail moving gently, and after a brief moment, it vanished into the darkness as silently as it had appeared, leaving Mira with the small gift and the weight of the encounter. The forest returned to its usual nocturnal rhythm, but she remained in place, her mind racing with the realization that her patience, calmness, and understanding had not been forgotten by the creatures she had nurtured. The act was subtle, unspoken, but it carried profound meaning, a gesture of recognition, a moment of mutual respect, and a quiet connection between human and wild. Mira sat by the fire long after the cub disappeared, staring into the flames, reflecting on the months of care, observation, and gentle guidance. She realized that the lessons she had taught were not about control or dominance. They were about patience, empathy, and showing that trust could coexist with instinct. The forest had accepted the cubs as its own, and yet they had chosen, in their own way, to remember her. This silent visit became a memory she would carry forever, a proof that true understanding transcends species, and that even in the wildest of hearts, kindness and patience leave a lasting mark. Years passed, and Mira's work with the predator cubs became more than just a story whispered among the staff at her small rehabilitation center. It grew into a recognized approach that reshaped the way wildlife rescuers thought about care and trust. Across the country, other rehabilitation centers began to adopt her methods, calling it the gentle trust approach. The name itself reflected everything Mira had stood for. Not dominance, not strict control, but patience, understanding, and a calm presence that allowed the wild animals to feel safe and make their own choices. Mira never liked the playful nickname people had given her at first, the Beast Tamer, because she knew in her heart that she had not tamed anything. The cubs she had cared for were still predators, still wild at their core. She had only given them the freedom to see that not all humans were threats, and that sometimes the world could offer calm instead of fear. In seminars and workshops, Mira shared her experiences, explaining how every hour spent sitting quietly by the cage, humming softly, and letting the cubs approach on their own had built something deeper than obedience. She told stories of the stormy nights when the cubs had pressed against the cage, trembling with fear, and how sitting beside them, showing patience instead of frustration, had been enough to calm them. She described how reading from her notebook, simply letting them observe her calm movements, had taught them to wait, to trust, and to rest without the instinct to fight over every moment. Those who attended her sessions often remarked on the simplicity of the method, yet the results spoke for themselves. Wild animals learning to coexist with humans, not out of subjugation, but out of understanding. Her story also became a quiet lesson for human behavior. In a world that often valued power, speed, and control, Mira demonstrated that restraint, kindness, and presence could create lasting impact. The cubs she had released into the forest were now leaders of their own packs, skilled and strong, yet calm and balanced, because they had been shown patience instead of forced compliance. Mira emphasized that true strength comes not from domination, but from connection, and that sometimes the gentlest approach yields the greatest results. Even years later, students and volunteers who came to her center would hear the story of the cubs who once snarled and snapped, yet learned to sit beside a human quietly while she ate her simple meal first, teaching them calmness without words. They learned that kindness was not weakness and that trust was a gift, not a reward. Mira's life and work became an enduring reminder that patience can shape behavior, empathy can heal instincts, and calm can leave a legacy stronger than fear ever could. The cubs, the forest, and the humans who witnessed her work all carried that lesson forward, a testament to the quiet power of care, understanding, and the courage to simply let the wild rest.